Son called me at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because I'd just poured my first cup of coffee and set it on the kitchen counter, and I remember thinking no one calls at that hour unless something is wrong. I picked up. Dad. That was it. Just Dad. The way he said it, flat and careful, like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed on the drive over. Elaine and I have been talking. We think it's best if you take a step back from our lives for a while. I didn't say anything. I stood there in my kitchen, in Knoxville, 63 years old, in my bathrobe, holding a phone that suddenly felt very heavy. Take a step back, I repeated. You make Elaine uncomfortable. She says every time you visit, she feels judged. And honestly, Dad, I've felt the same way for a long time. I thought about the last time I'd seen my son Marcus. It had been 3 weeks earlier, at his house, a Sunday dinner that Elaine had invited me to. I had brought a pie from the bakery on Merchant Street, the kind Marcus used to ask for every birthday when he was a kid, apple with the brown sugar crust. I'd sat at their table and talked about the weather, and asked about his work at the architecture firm, and complimented the new couch in the living room that I was pretty sure cost more than my first car. I hadn't said one critical word, not one. But that was the thing about Elaine. She didn't need words, she needed reasons. Let me back up. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, got up early, came home late, poured everything I had into making sure my family had what they needed. When my wife passed, Marcus was 22, just out of college. I didn't fall apart. I couldn't afford to. I kept the house, kept working, kept showing up. I thought that was what a father did. Marcus was a good kid growing up. Quiet, smart, serious about school. We weren't the type to say I love you every 5 minutes, but we understood each other. At least I thought we did. He met Elaine 4 years ago at some rooftop party in downtown Nashville where he'd relocated for work. She was charming, no question about that. Beautiful in that particular way that makes a room notice when she walks in. She laughed at everything he said and looked at him like he'd hung the moon. I was happy for him. I genuinely was. The first thing that gave me pause was about 6 months in, when Marcus mentioned, casual as you please, that Elaine had suggested he think about financial restructuring. That was the phrase he used. I asked what that meant. He said she thought it made more sense for them to pool everything together and manage it jointly, and maybe it was time to close out the savings account I'd been co-signed on with him since he was 19, the one we'd set up together when he got his first internship. I said fine, it was his money. He was 34 years old. What bothered me wasn't the account. It was that she'd asked him to do it within 6 months of meeting him, before they were even engaged, and he'd done it without blinking. After the engagement, things shifted in ways that were hard to put into words. Marcus started cancelling plans, not all at once, just a slow drift, the way a boat moves when no one's watching the rope. A birthday dinner rescheduled, a weekend visit that got pushed back indefinitely, phone calls that went to voicemail and got returned 2 days later with a vague, been crazy busy. I told myself it was normal. New relationship, new life. I didn't want to be the kind of father who couldn't let go. But then I started noticing something. Every time I did see Marcus, Elaine was there, and she had this way of sitting slightly apart from the conversation, phone in hand, monitoring. If Marcus laughed too hard at something I said, she'd go quiet. If we started talking about something from before her time, a family vacation, his mother, an old story, she'd find a reason to redirect. Babe, didn't you need to tell your dad about the renovation? Or, sorry to interrupt, but we have that thing at 7. There was always a thing at 7. The wedding was last spring. I was not asked to give a toast. Marcus told me 3 days before the ceremony that they'd decided to keep the program tight and only have Elaine's brother speak. I swallowed that. I sat in the front row at a venue that cost. And I only know this because Marcus had asked me to help with a portion of the deposit 8 months earlier, somewhere north of $40,000. I sat there in my good suit and watched my son get married. And I smiled and clapped and shook hands with people I'd never met and probably never would again. I did not make a scene. I was not difficult. I was exactly what a father is supposed to be at his son's wedding. quiet, proud, present. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station outside of Cookeville and sat in my truck for about 15 minutes before I trusted myself to drive again. Now it was the morning after Marcus's phone call, and I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to understand what take a step meant in practical terms for a 63-year-old man whose only son lived 90 minutes away. I hadn't done anything. I knew I hadn't. But I also knew that wasn't really the point. Here's what people don't always understand about situations like this. The issue is rarely what they say the issue is. Elaine didn't feel judged by me. Elaine felt that Marcus's attention, his history, his loyalty, things that existed before she ever walked into that rooftop party, were resources she hadn't fully acquired yet, and I was a reminder that some of him predated her. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I've had a lot of time to think about it, and that's the most honest explanation I can come up with. What I did next, I didn't do out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I'm a deliberate person by nature. 31 years in structural engineering will do that to you. You learn not to make decisions under stress. You learn to look at the load-bearing elements before you touch anything. So I waited a week. I went to work. I consult part-time now for a firm out of Chattanooga. I went to the grocery store. I called my sister in Asheville. I took my usual walk around the neighborhood in the evenings. I let the situation sit. And then I called my attorney. His name is not important. What's important is that he's been my attorney for 22 years, and he knows my affairs better than I do. I told him what had happened. I told him I wanted to review everything, every document, every arrangement, every financial instrument that had my son's name on it in any capacity. There were a few things. The most significant was the house. Marcus and Elaine lived in a house in a suburb east of Nashville. It was a nice house. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, good school district. The kind of neighborhood where people pressure wash their driveways on Saturday mornings. They'd bought it 2 years ago. What Elaine did not know, what Marcus may have forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to mention, was that I held a secondary lien on that property. When they'd gone to buy the house, Marcus had come to me because they were short on the down payment. The Nashville market was insane at the time, and the house they wanted was going fast. I'd given him $62,000, structured not as a gift but as a documented private loan with a promissory note and a recorded lien against the property. My attorney had handled all of it. It was clean, it was legal, and it was recorded with the county clerk's office in plain sight of anyone who cared to look. Marcus had signed the note. He knew what it was. Now, I had no intention of doing anything rash. I wasn't going to call in the loan or file for foreclosure. I'm not that kind of man. But what I did do was send a formal letter, drafted by my attorney, mailed certified, to Marcus and Elaine at the property address, reminding them of the terms of the note, confirming that I was the lien holder of record, and politely noting that per the terms, I was entitled to annual financial disclosure of the property's maintenance and insurance status. It was a routine letter, completely within my rights, nothing aggressive about it. I mailed it on a Thursday. On Saturday morning, my phone rang 41 times before noon. The first call was Marcus. He was confused, which I understood. The second call was Elaine, which surprised me. She'd never called with Elaine, which surprised me. She'd never called me directly before, not once in 4 years. I let them both go to voicemail. The third call was a number I didn't recognize, and when I listened to the message later, it turned out to be a man who introduced himself as Elaine's father, calling to discuss the situation. He had the cordial tone of a man who was not actually cordial. I did not call any of them back that day. I went for my walk. I made dinner, chicken and roasted sweet potatoes, nothing fancy. I watched about 40 minutes of a documentary about the Tennessee Valley Authority before I fell asleep in my chair. The calls continued through Sunday. Marcus left a voicemail that started with, "Dad, this is completely out of nowhere," and ended with, "We need to talk about this before it gets out of hand." Elaine left a voicemail that was more direct. She said that she and Marcus felt the letter was hostile and designed to intimidate, and that they were consulting with their own attorney. By Monday morning, I had 41 voicemails and 16 text messages. I want to tell you something about that moment. I wasn't happy about it, not in the way you might expect, not in some triumphant way. It was more like the feeling you get when a bridge you've been worried about finally shows its fault line. Not satisfaction, just clarity. Because here's what that letter revealed, and what those 41 calls confirmed. Elaine had never told Marcus about the lien. Or if she had known, she'd decided it wasn't a problem because she'd assumed I would never act on it. She'd built her entire architecture of control around the assumption that I would keep my mouth shut and my head down and be grateful for whatever scraps of my son's attention she decided to allow. She had not done her homework. On Tuesday, I called Marcus back. I kept my voice even. I told him I wasn't trying to cause trouble, that the letter was a formality, and that I had no immediate plans to exercise any of my rights under the note. I also told him, calmly and without drama, that I wanted to have a direct conversation. Just the two of us, no Elaine, no attorneys, before the end of the week. There was a pause on the line that lasted maybe 4 seconds. She'd want to be part of that conversation, he said. I know, I said, but I'm asking for a conversation with my son. Another pause. I'll see what I can do. He called back 2 hours later and said he could meet me for lunch on Thursday. Just him. We met at a diner in Murfreesboro, halfway between us. A place with red vinyl booths and photographs of old downtown on the walls. We'd been there once before, maybe 12 years ago, when he was in college and I'd driven up to help him move apartments. He looked tired. He'd lost a little weight. He ordered coffee and then didn't drink it. I didn't lecture him. I didn't list grievances. I didn't tell him everything I'd observed about Elaine over 4 years. I'm 63 years old, and I've learned enough to know that when a man is caught between his father and his wife, telling him his wife is the problem is the fastest way to lose the argument and the man. What I told him was simpler than that. I told him I loved him. I told him I had been present for every significant moment of his life since the day he was born, and I would continue to be present as long as I was alive, on whatever terms were honest and workable. I told him I held no grudge about the phone call. I told him that the letter was not an attack and that the lien was not a weapon. It was a document, and documents are neutral until someone decides to make them otherwise. Then I told him one more thing. I said, Marcus, your mother would have been 61 this year. You know what she always said about money? She said it's not about the money. It's about who gets to make decisions. Make sure you're the one making yours. He didn't say anything for a while. He looked out the window at the parking lot. A woman was trying to coax a golden retriever into the back seat of an SUV. We watched her for a moment. She doesn't know about the lien, he said finally. I forgot to tell her. I nodded. I didn't say anything. She's going to think I hid it. Did you? He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. Not on purpose. I believed him. Probably shouldn't have, but I did. That was the first honest thing he'd said to me in 2 years, maybe longer. The first thing that sounded like my son, instead of a man reading from a script. We told for another hour. I won't say it fixed everything, because it didn't. You don't undo 4 years of slow erasure over a plate of eggs in Murfreesboro. But something shifted. Some small load-bearing thing that had been bent finally got straightened out. On the drive home, he called me. He must have pulled over because the call came through about 20 minutes after we left the parking lot. He said, I shouldn't have made that call to you, the one at 6:47. I didn't ask how he knew I'd noted the time. He's my son. He knows me. No, I said, you shouldn't have. I'm sorry, Dad. I told him I knew that. Here's where I've landed, 2 months out from all of this. The lien is still on the property. I haven't called the loan in, and I don't plan to. That was never the point. The point was simply to remind everyone involved, including myself, that I existed, that I had standing, that 63 years of living and 31 years of working and $62,000 of trust could not just be quietly walked out of the picture because someone new had arrived and decided the picture would be prettier without me. Elaine and I have not spoken. I don't know if we ever will. Marcus came over for dinner 3 Saturdays ago, just him, same as when he was in his 20s. We ordered barbecue and watched whatever game was on and didn't talk about any of it. That was fine. That was more than fine. My sister asked me, when I told her the whole story, whether I'd been trying to hurt them by sending that letter. I thought about it honestly. No, what I was trying to do was stop disappearing. There's a difference. I'm not sure everyone understands it, but there is. You can spend your whole life giving, your money, your time, your presence, your silence, and still find yourself slowly made irrelevant by people who've decided that your generosity is just the natural order of things, not something anyone owes you anything for. I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm 63 years old, and I've been around long enough to know gratitude doesn't work on a schedule. Kids come around when they come around, if they come around. You can't force that. What you can do is make sure you've never given away so much of yourself that there's nothing left with leverage. Not leverage in the cold, transactional sense. Leverage in the human sense, the kind that reminds people you're a real person with a real history and real skin in the game. My son called me last Sunday. We talked for 45 minutes. He asked about my consulting work. I asked about his. At some point, he said, out of nowhere, "Remember that apple pie from Merchant Street?" I said I remembered. "They're still open," he said. "I know," I said. "I was just there." Neither of us said what we meant by that. We didn't need to. That's the thing about a father and son who've known each other for 35 years. You can say the whole thing without saying any of it. The coffee at my kitchen counter had gone cold by the time I finished that phone call, the same way it had the morning all this started. But this time, I didn't mind reheating it. Some things are worth the extra minute. I've been thinking about that apple pie a lot lately. Not the pie itself. The fact that Marcus remembered it, that he brought it up on a Sunday phone call out of nowhere, like it had been sitting somewhere in him the whole time waiting for a moment when it was safe to come back out. That's how it works, I think. The things that are real don't disappear. They just go quiet for a while. When I look back at what happened, the phone call, the letter, the 41 missed calls, the diner in Murfreesboro, I don't see a story about revenge. I see a story about what happens when a person stops pretending. For years I'd been telling myself that keeping the peace meant staying small, that being a good father meant absorbing whatever came at me without comment. I thought that was the decent thing to do, and in some ways it was. But there's a version of decency that slides over time into erasure, and I'd let myself get erased. The letter I sent wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of honesty. I had a legal right, a documented stake, a real presence in my son's life that predated Elaine by 3 decades, and I had allowed that presence to be treated as something embarrassing, something to be managed. Sending that letter was me refusing to keep pretending I didn't exist. That's all it was. What I've come to understand is that integrity, real integrity, not the performative kind, sometimes looks uncomfortable from the outside. It's easy to be decent when everyone around you is being decent back. The harder thing is staying honest and clear-headed when the people you love are behaving in ways that don't make sense. Marcus wasn't a bad person. He was a man who had stopped thinking for himself, and he didn't even know it. Pointing that out gently, without malice, without a list of grievances, that required something I had to consciously choose. Not anger, precision. There's something I want to say about strength, because I think people confuse it with hardness. I didn't send that letter because I was hard. I sent it because I'd thought it through carefully, waited a week, consulted someone I trusted, and made a deliberate decision. That's not toughness in the aggressive sense. That's the kind of steadiness that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to abandon that under pressure. 31 years of engineering taught me that. You don't fix a compromised structure by ignoring the fault line. You locate it, you document it, and you address it clearly. And Marcus, I think what shifted in that diner wasn't the conversation itself. It was that I showed up, that I asked for time alone with my son and didn't back down when Elaine wanted to be included. I held that one small boundary and didn't apologize for it. Sometimes that's all it takes, not a grand gesture. Just one honest line that you don't let anyone talk you out of. I'm 63 years old. I have maybe 20 good years left if I take care of myself. I'm not spending them making myself smaller so other people feel more comfortable. That's not bitterness. That's just arithmetic. The coffee that morning reheated. It tasted fine, better than fine actually. Some things just need a little time before they're right again.